Hello and welcome to this week's Credible Live broadcast. I am here with our CEO and Chairman, Brian Fitzpatrick, and this week we are joined by Josh Kincaid. Josh is the Director of Financial Operations at Robo-Advisor Hero, and he's here today to discuss his history in the cannabis industry and his vision of the future. Thank you for being on the show today, Josh. To get us started, could you tell us a little bit more about your background and the work that you're currently doing?
Yeah, so I grew up in Seattle. I got an internship at the World Trade Center as an international project manager. I got into banking through that venture and then worked as a stockbroker managing a $650 million fund. And then a friend of mine got multiple sclerosis, kind of threw a wrench in my whole life. But eventually he encouraged me to get into the cannabis industry, and I dabbled into that for about 10 years and then recently started an investment advisory firm. So I'm the Director of Financial Operations for an SEC registered investment advisor. We focus on niche investments like cannabis and crypto, but I use artificial intelligence and machine learning software to fully automate my trading. And I've been focused on that since about 2020.
Well, I don't know if you know this about me, but I had a cycling team for a number of years that supported the MS Society, and we raised a lot of money over the years for MS. It's a debilitating disease, and I'm sorry to hear that you had a friend dealing with that. It's terrible. Yeah. Well, great to have you on the show today. We have a lot to talk about. We find ourselves always in this interesting times of cannabis. I got in the industry really around 2018, 2019. And at that time, everybody was very excited about, where it was and where it was going. And, after sort of the initial optimism sort of wore off, we started to see the industry slide. But it really talks about, where is it that we're going? Because it's constantly up and down, right? And Taylor, if you would just sort of put up the chart that I have there. One of the things that I have followed is what the sort of the U.S. cannabis ETF looked like, and this was when the height of that is when I got in on the industry. So I was with everybody, very excited about the industry, and then it really started to take a dive on these cannabis stocks, and we're starting to now see some recovery. But it really begs the question sort of as to what we think is going to be happening. We're seeing changes in the political landscape. We're seeing, lots of stuff sort of going on relative to, quality and transparency and approval in various states. So, what are your thoughts about where we are and sort of where we're going to be going?
Yeah, where are we? It's a good question, because it's an interesting spot where we're at right now. And I can tell you that, MJ BizCon is happening right now. There's a lot of people talking about predictions in the industry, where we're going to be headed. And yet I feel like there's a lot of subject matter experts that don't really know where we're headed or what we're doing. So for example, last year at MJ BizCon, somebody had mentioned that 2024 was going to be year of the women, right? But in 2023, more women left the industry than ever. So I feel like there's a lot of people on the East Coast that maybe just recently jumped in the industry without paying attention to the West Coast. I feel like there's a lot of sideways movement, and we're repeating a lot of the same patterns. So just from my experience, I feel like there's a lot of redundancies and repeating of similar mistakes we've made in the past.
It's interesting. Like when I first got in, I was very optimistic about the potential, in the industry, and I'm still optimistic about it. But my enthusiasm really became tempered by a lot of the regulatory concerns, and my enthusiasm sort of started to create a mix of optimism and caution, right? And it made me more bullish on the sector's long-term prospect, which I remain bullish on the long-term prospect of the industry. And because, if you go back to it, if you like, I think that the sales was around 14.9 billion, right? Which was like a 46% increase from the prior year, 2018. So in 2019, we were looking at these impressive projections, and, that the market could hit 40 billion by 2024. And I think it was this year will probably be about 33 billion. So not terribly far off, but yet, you're looking also, I was very mindful of the fact that it's federally illegal. There's an uncertain timeline relative to that, whatever's going to happen, rescheduling, descheduling. But it really strengthened my bullish outlook. So I believe that as regulations evolve and become more favorable, it's going to unlock tremendous value in the sector. So we've sort of had this time where we've had the initial folks that were sort of coming into the industry, and investors were backing them. And then we saw from that chart, obviously, that the stocks went down, investment dollars started to go away. But now, we're seeing some softening. So with that in mind, where's your head sort of as one of those speculators, or if you were an investor, walk us through a bit of your history, and then when did you enter the industry, and what was the landscape like at that time, and where do you really see it going?
That's a great question. There's a lot where I see. Let me answer the first part first of where I see the industry now, and then why it's important to kind of pay attention to what's happening. What I'm seeing in the industry, at least in Vegas, and maybe this is my hope and dream, is that more lockers are going to be a thing. But Amazon style lockers are at least in Vegas now. So when you pre-order, you can get there, and that eliminates the line, reduces a lot of costs, makes it quick and easy, and better for that customer experience. You're seeing a lot more SKUs, a lot more products in stores nationwide. And I think that we're going to see more strain stability. What happened to the Blue Dream and Acapulco Gold, some of these old school strains, we're seeing brand new strains all of the time. And I think, especially with Schedule 3, definitely going to see strain consistency. But again, back to that sideways movement, because I think if you don't pay attention to what's happened, you're doomed to repeat it. And so, I love this quote from a civil rights activist, James Baldwin. He said, if you don't know where you came from, then there's absolutely no limitations to where you can go. And if you don't pay attention to what's happening in Washington, then how can you really move forward in an efficient way? So in Washington, we were one of the first states that legalized. In 1998, we did that. But if you jumped into a building and got a rent space, you would have been paying for 3 years without being able to open, because we didn't have stores until 2011. So if you weren't prepared for taxes, for example, you would have been shocked in 2014 when we had a 37% sales tax. And then all this crazy rules that maybe didn't know how to navigate, you would have been able to prepare for it, knowing that it's happened in Colorado or Washington. Washington regulated adult use. So in 2015, we came out with a regulated marketplace, but with no vertical integration. It's one of the only ones that retail can't be a producer or a processor. And then we had felonies on home grows, felonies on cafes, and then they even regulated not being able to throw away your dirt. So if you were a concentrate company, they were going to limit that in 2019. I think 2016, they tried to limit colors for edible companies that were too attractive to children. Vapegate in 2019. There's all of these things that and that's why we have so many SKUs. We have 2,000 products out here, mostly because of diversification. Because if you were a concentrate only company, you got nailed. Vape companies couldn't sell for 3 months during Vapegate. And so they figured out that you have to diversify, and you have to have a number of products and SKUs in order to survive. And if you're not paying attention to that, you're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah, and it's when you look at some of what's happened in the past, I mean, some of these things have set up for a better future, and some of these things have set up for the fact that we need to change. We need lots of things to change, and I think some of the sentiment and the progress to me has got to come from the government, the federal government, and that they've got to get serious about this. So based on recent statements and positions of the incoming POTUS of Trump, and of course he has nominated for Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy. They both seem very bullish on this industry and supportive. So I know Trump supports rescheduling marijuana to Schedule 3. He came out and said it, during his campaign. He backs opening up banking services for cannabis businesses, which I think is huge in providing those safe harbors through safer banking. He endorses states' rights to pass their own marijuana laws, so which, of course, they've been doing. He wants to keep that in the state, but obviously the rescheduling is going to help tremendously. Now, he indicated that he would vote yes on Florida's Amendment 3, but we saw what happened there. I mean, that Florida did not approve recreational. They needed a super majority, not just a majority. And I think they came somewhat close, but no cigar there. And also aims to end arrest and incarcerations for small amounts of personal marijuana use. So I think what he's stated as his goals sounds good. We've got to see, obviously, if amongst everything else going on, he's going to make that happen. But that, to me, I think is going to unlock and set the pace for good things to happen in the industry, one of which I believe is going to be the investor sentiment's got to improve. They've got to be able to see this if the federal government is heading in this direction. And of course, Kennedy has advocated for federal legalization, like completely deschedule this thing, drive for federal legalization. He has also gone on record as supporting decriminalization of cannabis at the federal level, proposing a federal tax, of course. I mean, you've dealt with what went on in Washington. I mean, what 37% was the height of those taxes just at the state level. So add a federal tax to that, you wonder how some of these companies will be able to survive with margins. But with 280E going away, I think that's significant if it can go away through descheduling or rescheduling. So I know that he's advocated that we should legalize marijuana, this being Kennedy, and should have this federal tax, but opening all of this up to proper research. I mean, what are your thoughts? Is this going to happen? Is this a pipe dream, or is this just more politicians promising things they can't deliver?
Yeah, with Chuck Schumer, how can you be optimistic about anything, right? But it's actually the most optimistic I've been about any bureaucrat ever. I think what he's going to do with healthcare is going to reform everything, and it's going to be good for psychedelics and cannabis to be hopefully descheduled. I think that Schedule 3 is going to be absolutely horrific for the industry. It's going to be good in the sense that Schedule 3 is going to allow for research and development. So you're going to have improved access for patients, right? I think that recognizing medical applications is going to reduce stigma, and that's good for the industry's legitimacy. I think banking reform is important for safety and security, but also just getting traditional access to banking. You mentioned 280E and just the immediate, probably 30 to 50% increase in profitability from being able to write off your deductions on that. But I also think it's a Trojan horse. So I think it's going to weed out a majority of the existing players. Cannabis businesses are going to have to comply with federal regulations. They're not ready for all of that. There's a Controlled Substances Act, the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. They have regulations like ISO, GMP. And if you look at Washington as an example, we had over 1,000 growers. It's down to maybe about 100 now. And only 3 dozen haven't been hit with the violation. So if Schedule 3 forces retailers to qualify as a pharmacist, or at least kind of carve out some cannabis-only pharmacy, that might work. Otherwise, a lot of these businesses are not going to survive as Schedule 3. I would think if we get Schedule 3, you're going to see 97.5% of the entire industry consolidated before we get some kind of Cannabis 2.0, where you have some kind of quality rising from the ashes, local artisanal cannabis. But in terms of the upcoming administration, yes, they have to improve a lot of things already. But you mentioned RFK. I think he could decriminalize cannabis and psychedelics to fund some recovery programs he's talked about. And if the Trump administration decriminalizes cannabis, that is the best thing by far. That's going to spark this rally we haven't seen since 2016. I think you'll bring in the private equity that's been on the sidelines. I think that it's going to allow for interstate commerce, which in my opinion is the biggest driver that we'll see more than anything else, is utilizing that dormant commerce clause, or at least establishing interstate commerce, would be more than banking, more than anything else.
So your Schedule 3 scenario is not a rosy one.
Not at all.
So, because you think that's going to, force a lot of these companies to have to do things differently relative to making these drugs available, because that's really what it becomes at the end of the day, and they have to act more like a pharmacy than they are in the more open recreational market. Is that what you're saying? Is that one of the things you're saying?
That's part of it. Yeah. I mean, just think about the consistency with drugs. You have to be consistent, yet we have new strains every day. So how do you keep all of those levels consistent? They would literally have to carve out a new Schedule 3 for cannabis only. Because if you look at pharmaceuticals, they're not selling it in anything else other than a pharmacy. So either cannabis rec shops have to be granted a pharmacy, or or cannabis is all going to be distributed through pharmacies, and it's going to be through probably pills, but it's not going to be flower. You're not going to be smoking that because of the inconsistencies. So I think it's going to be really, really detrimental to the industry. Everyone's cheering it on without thinking about the long-term effects. Just look at Schedule 3. Is there anything comparable that you can look at cannabis and go, yeah, that's a good fit? Nothing at all works with this. Is for big pharma, and that's it.
Well, I mean, yeah, because you look at it, there's Tylenol, testosterone, all of those different things that either require a prescription or, are go through the FDA, right? So, so how does it work? Like, if they just descheduled entirely, I mean, what are your thoughts if they were? Because honestly, I could see where they could take a leap. I mean, this is a bold administration, and I think that if any administration would do something really bold and deschedule, it could be this incoming administration. So if that happens and they just say, "Hey, we're going to forget about rescheduling. We're just going to completely deschedule this," how does that change the scenario?
Well, it's going to make everything seem like 2016 with that fervor of being able to do whatever you want to do. So I think it's going to be more of an aggressive stance on that Cole memo when the feds kicked the can down to the state level, and then each state got to deal with its own laws. So with decriminalization, you're going to get the federal government out of the way, which is absolutely my favorite preference. Get the government out of it and let the individuals in the states deal with it. And then they can do interstate commerce together without the government. We don't need them to tell us what to do. It's okay if Idaho never wants to legalize. That's up to them. But the rest of us are going to be in business. And I'd rather have access to my state reps to tell them how we should process CO2 extracts, for example, rather than the feds telling me what carbon I can use to make extracts. I think by having that local authenticity and culture is what's going to drive the industry, rather than having some uniform federal policy and procedure. It's going to just drown out the industry and not allow for a lot of this innovation that we desperately need.
Okay, so we definitely need innovation. We definitely need, I mean, we need interstate commerce. Okay. But how do we get the safety, and how do we, govern the safety standards in this industry, much as the way that we govern food safety? I mean, that's, I think, the unknown question, or the unknown answer, because every state, I mean, I just can't believe the differences in testing standards and quality standards. And, what, I mean, you look at some states testing for like 90 plus things, and some states testing for 40 or 50. It's all over the board. And now we're starting to see illnesses. We're starting to see recalls increase. So I guess that's a double-edged sword, right? If we put the power in the states, how do we get the standards of safety to be consistent across the states? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up and kind of clarify, because when you look at certain industries like the camera industry, Nikon from Japan sets the standards, not any federal government or NGO or nobody, but Japan sets it. I'm sorry, Europe has the regulations where a camera from Japan, for example, can only be 20 minutes. And if it records longer than 20 minutes, a professional camera, and they tax you to all end. So that's the regulations. If you look at the automotive industry, California drives what happens, and all automotive manufacturers develop everything with the regulations to California, because if you set it to California's restrictions, then you're good everywhere else. With the camera industry, if you can make it to Europe standards, you're good everywhere else. So to your point, or maybe this isn't your point, it's my point. Florida's not going to grow. North Dakota is not going to grow. We're going to have California growing. We're going to have Eastern Washington growing. Look where coffee beans are at. Look where wine is at. And that's where you're going to have cannabis. It's not going to be in Tennessee or Oklahoma. It's not going to be growing in very many states. That's why I said 97.5% of the industry is going to be wiped out, because you're not going to have hundreds or thousands of growers. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have regional places that do it, and they're going to have their own regulations. Hopefully they'll have something other than the feds, where it's like in banking, they have their own intermediary that they talk to, like FINRA. That's a financial industry regulatory authority that's governed by the banks, not by the feds. And so when you create your own banking laws, then you tell the feds what to do. That's kind of what cannabis needs, is something similar to where the industry creates the rules and then tells the government what we do. But I don't think we're going to have 50 states growing. It's not going to be that big. I think there's going to be massive consolidation, because most people don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe you get sort of these micro brands, like even in the wine industry. I'm here in New Jersey, and they do make wine in New Jersey. It's not a big part of the, of the economy, right? And it's not as good, quite frankly, as getting it from California. But for sure. So I could see where that makes sense. And it will really become more of a retail driven sales operation, as opposed to within the various states, as opposed to sort of the cultivation in every state, where you have to do everything in the state. Why? Because there's no interstate commerce. It's federally illegal. So if you're able to open up the interstate commerce, then I think it's going to solve a lot of the supply type problems that we have in these individual states, and really sounds like it would be driven more to a retail sort of wholesale commerce exercise on the back end, as opposed to the growing side. That's an interesting perspective. I appreciate you sharing that with us, Josh. One of the things that I've sort of been looking at is, in the beginning, investors were very bullish, and I think they started backing a lot of these operators that knew how to grow. They knew the plant, they knew the product, but they didn't know the business. Like, they didn't know how to operate a business. So I just saw this from the first time I started going to BizCon, to, as BizCon has evolved, the industry, you can see how the industry's evolved, because now you see more suits in the room, right? You're seeing more professionals from other industries come in. And now you're seeing, I think, investors demanding that there'll be professional operators, like a professional CFO, like hiring the right consultants and the right infrastructure, for a business to ensure that it operates. Because what we've seen is a lot of companies burn through a lot of cash and still not figure out how to make money. So, what's your thought about how the rules are changing, with some of these investors? And do you really believe that they're going to come back, and what's it going to take for them to get them back in here in force?
Either a deschedule, legalization, or even Schedule 3, anything other than the current situation, I think. And with that, I think once investors do step in, there will be management changes, because a lot of these individuals are like deer in headlights. They're incapable of expanding because they don't want to take on debt, or they're afraid of taking on additional investors. They're just out of their element. They're out of their league. Maybe they were decent with small business, but if an investor is going to come in and scale them up, those individuals will probably be pushed out. We've already seen a lot of that, actually. In Oregon was a really interesting market, because there was cooperation on the surface, but a lot of infighting. And a lot of those businesses, I mean, I'll throw it out there. Lunchbox Alchemy was a really good company, and it failed because of infighting. Just like they should have taken off. They should be a name brand everywhere. And if companies like that fail for that, there's going to be other reasons. There's a restaurant that was really good, and here locally in Seattle, and the restaurant expanded to 3 stores, and then the owners got a divorce, and then all 3 locations fell apart. We see that consistently regardless of the industry, but in cannabis, it's even more so because there were so many altruistic people that were unwilling to pay themselves, and then they got into financial debt, and then there's this a lot of ego, there's just a lot of infighting, I guess. And so I think if investors do come in, they're going to have to just clean house and make it a lot more traditional. And we do have traditional finance. We have traditional banking, but people don't want to pay for it. There's free AI tools that people can go out and grab too for accounting or bookkeeping, or not even just finance, but social media, or a 24-hour AI customer service to pick up the phone. There's a lot of financial tools, a lot of automation, a lot of things that people could be doing, but they just don't.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It sort of begs the question of what have you seen about how the industries use technology, and what's wrong with the way that people are sort of adapting some of these technologies, and what needs to be done to improve the whole situation?
Yeah, what have I seen?
Well, you said that like nobody's really taking advantage of some of the technical tools to run lean and mean.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I assume that's the point you were making, right?
It is, yeah. So there's a shop right down the street from me. It's within walking distance almost. But if you order online and get there, they say, oh, we don't have it. And so I just end up driving 30 minutes. I pass half a dozen stores, and I go there because their inventory is good. So what I noticed is if it's pre-rolls and they have automation, the pre-rolls are still trash. A lot of them are trash. With the inventory control, they have POS systems. But what I'm seeing overall is regardless of what the technology is, they're not utilizing it. They're not using it very well, whether it's joint rolling machines, POS. There's plenty of data. There's BDS analytics, and Headset has phenomenal reports. There's all of this stuff that you could incorporate and utilize for your operations and your financial bottom line, and they just don't. I think there's a lot of ego. I've heard people tell me that they're only going to allow the best fire genetics in their store, and you have no control over that, really. So there's a lot of naive individuals out there that investors are not going to put up with.
Yeah. I think there's definitely going to continue to be a change there in those disciplines around the use of technology and the right people that have success in operating businesses. So, how can people get in touch with you? And what if they want to work with you? What are you doing out there where people might want to reach out to you and get in touch?
These days, I'm mostly focused on the financial markets with an SEC registered investment advisory service. But they can hit me up on LinkedIn, or they can send me an email at josh@thetalkinghedge.com. Hedge is in a bush or hedge fund. josh@thetalkinghedge.com.
Nice. I like that angle. It plays either way, right?
That's right.
So that's good. Well, we're hoping to see good things happen. I've gotten tired of answering the question of what's going to happen relative to descheduling, rescheduling, and I've made too many predictions, and I'm not making them anymore. So we'll wait and see what happens, because there's just so much going on. And speaking of technology, one of the greatest uses of technology in this industry to me has to be for reducing the cost of compliance, reducing or I should say, increasing the ability to comply with good manufacturing standards and ISO standards, tracking, product in a way that goes beyond seed, sale, track, and trace, because that's not necessarily leaning towards reducing your expenses internally and driving quality. And that's really what Credible is about. And Taylor, next week, who why don't you talk about? I'm excited about this guest. So just remind our audience who we've got next week. It's been great talking to you, Josh, because I know that you've got your fingers on the pulse of a lot of what's going on financially. And we talked about it today. We talked about the importance of quality. So Taylor, who's joining us next week?
Yes, next week we will have Darwin Millard joining the show. He's the technical director at Cannabis Safety and Quality, and he's going to be discussing important information that we need to know about safety in the cannabis industry. So please join us next Friday, December 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern for our final episode of the year.
Darwin's brilliant as it relates to all the safety, and he really, I mean, I can say this, he really geeks out about this stuff and knows a lot about it. So it's been great talking with you today, Josh, giving us a perspective sort of where we've been, where we are, and more importantly, also talking about where we're going. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see our audience next week.
Thanks.